Top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. So, as always, Benham Christinet. As most of you recall, this would be the 20th anniversary since the attacks of September 11th, 2001. And I thought I would invite us firstly then just in a brief silence in memory of the lives lost 20 years ago today. So let us pray. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. It is Rachel weeping for her children, and she will not be consoled because they are no more. Requiem aeternam dona est Domine, et lux perpetua luceat es. Requiescant in pace. Amen. So our first reading this morning can be found on page 99. We're almost at the triple digits of our page numbering. And we pick up again with our discussion of renegade demons. So when triumphant, these renegade demons reduce us to little more than a shadow of our former selves, isolated from family and society, full of shame, remorse, and self-deprecation. This pattern entrenches us more deeply in the very addictions that have now become our only source of pleasure, or at least temporary relief from our inner state of anguish. The only thing worse than the addiction itself is the prospect of freeing ourselves from it. Like Israel being led through the wilderness by Moses, the promised land seems too far off. Anything would be better than wandering through the desert wasteland of our hearts, not knowing where our emotional sustenance will come from next. So our second reading follows on page 100. The moment we think we have mustered enough resolve to strike out in search of our freedom, we find ourselves with Israel, longing for the days of our enslavement. If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up. and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. It's from Numbers chapter 11. As it turns out, we love our addictions. Despite our enslavement to them, we prefer the meager scraps of fish and garlic they provide to real spiritual freedom. We prefer the routine safety and the comfort of our enslavement to facing the unknown wilderness of our heart. Addictions mask our deepest fears. Better to stick with the slavery we know than confront the fears required of real freedom. And therein lies the power of our renegade demons. Let us pray. O Lord, remember not only the men and women of goodwill, but also those of evil will. But do not remember all the suffering they have inflicted upon us. Remember the fruits we have borne thanks to this suffering, our comradeship, our loyalty, our humility, our courage, our generosity, the greatness of heart which has grown out of all this. And when they come to judgment, let all the fruits that we have borne be their forgiveness. Amen. That leads us to our sharing for this morning. So as always, I invite your thoughts or comments or questions on what we've just read from Contemplating Christ this morning, and you have the floor. Nicola, please, good morning.
Page 99. It makes me feel so sad, the idea at the bottom of the page. Anything would be better than wandering through the desert wasteland of our hearts, not knowing where our emotional sustenance will come from next. I've never thought of that before in terms of addiction, and it fills me with such compassion, because of course that would be so terrifying, and I've never really thought of the terror behind it. My mother was an alcoholic, and she actually quit drinking the last 10 years or so of her life, but I encountered those demons, literal demons, if you will, if there is such a phrase, with her. I found her one night standing up on her bed, fighting with a general or some military type of person. And, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I remember the moment so well. And I talked to other family members about it when I could get my shit together, and they had all experienced her in that way, and no one had ever said anything. There was a lot of silence around that, but understanding the fear she would have had to have given up that emotional comfort, it just adds so much space to that. And thank you for that. I mean, your understanding of this is just remarkable. And, I don't want to go there, but when I do, it's so liberating. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. I really appreciate those comments. And indeed, it's so often almost become a truism of how much addiction of any kind masks a host of undealt with issues. And I feel that the whole Exodus narrative is a collective metaphor for what we all go through, and how indeed, it's a difficult journey to the promised land of freedom from any of our addictions or demons, because they do provide a certain degree of comfort. We all hear the term a functional alcoholic who can't deal with the stresses of life without that drink in the morning or whatever the case may be. There's a way, but there's always a price to pay for that. And I think that the idea of trying somebody in that position to get through the day without that Dutch courage or whatever words you want to give that is indeed terrifying. And we see that come to expression in the middle of this wasteland, right? The wilderness, where they're like, hey, at least back there, we had routine. We knew our next meal. There was something comforting in what we did have, as meager as it was, than not knowing what the next minute's going to bring. And I think that is the journey, the spiritual journey for all of us. And whether we're dealing with, physical addictions to drugs or alcohol, or other types of psychological addictions or whatever, there's a lot of fear behind it. And I think that's why there's a lot of resistance to meditation, because we're forced to look at those things. It's hard. Thank you for sharing that. Hey there, Sid. Good morning.
Good morning. That wandering in the desert felt like a denial system. Jesus said to Judas, "It'd been better if you never been born." But I think he's talking about it'd been better if denial had never been born. Could you speak of that a little bit? What denial means, how it's kind of the root of evil, that kind of thing, if you wish.
Sure. And just to make sure I heard you right, Jesus said that to Judas, better had he never been born. But what you think he meant was, I missed what you said there.
I think he meant that better had denial had never been born. Denial is the root of all sin. It seems like you can address that.
Yeah, I think that denial is at the very least plays a huge role in the facilitation of sin. Even if it's not necessarily the origin of it, it's the means through which that to me, by the way, that's a question mark. I would have to think further to look at the question of denial as origin, but at the very least, I see it as the condition under which, and by sin in this case, I mean, destructive behavior, be that to myself or to others. It's the arena or the place or the major highway on which this has such easy access to do its work, as it were. And so much is allowed to happen and unfold in the midst of our denial, right? And it holds things that need to be dealt with in stasis. It puts blocks where there should be progress. It allows us to turn our heads from things that are too scary or ugly or painful. So that state of denial, as it were, I think is the thing that facilitates the various brokennesses, the various renegade demons in us to have their day. And as we'll see, I think also is the thing that facilitates, perhaps more than anything, the demons that in this case, I'm calling the parasites, because it's precisely in not looking at the world around us, not wanting to be taken from our complacency and our places of comfort, that we're held in that place. And there's a lot of denial in that, right? Does that make sense to see that role? Now, to your question, whether it's the origin, I truly would want to give that some more thought. Only because I'd never occurred to me before. But if you have something along those lines you'd like to share, I'm certainly happy to hear your sense of that. Not to put you on the spot, just to say I haven't given it enough thought to know how I would respond to that piece of it. But I definitely see its role in facilitating brokenness.
It's kind of in the Adam and Eve story too, the devil made me do it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and Frank, right, and how each of them kind of passes the buck. Adam says, "Not me, it was her," and she says, "Well, it's not me, it was the snake." And it kind of just goes down the line. And that, in a sense, is where you can also see, I think, on a social level, what one author called of the Nazi sort of regime, the banality of evil. It's just passing the buck. I'm just part of a big system here. I didn't do anything. I'm just signing papers. I'm just putting the stamp here. And you don't acknowledge that, in fact, you are a link in a long chain of structures that are allowing this to happen, and that needs all the link for not to be broken. But when you just see yourself as a link and not the chain, you're in a major state of denial that allows all manner of untold evil to unfold, and with our complicit participation, right? It's very difficult. Yeah. Thank you, Sid.
What occurred to me and it stood out for me in the readings was about the illusion, at least, of safety and stability in being a slave. That there was, that they didn't, the being out on their own was very frightening.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of began to think back to the times of Egypt when they didn't have to have that freedom to deal with. And I think that's, I think of the countries of the world, it's historically, I believe it's very hard to keep a democracy. People, that authoritarianism seems so safe somehow, that there's somebody to tell you what to do. And another example of that type of thing is I worked with kids in trouble. I worked at a detention center for juveniles. And I don't mean to say that this is a bad thing, because it often is a completely saving thing for these kids. But kids who were just out of control, couldn't, seem to help themselves from getting into trouble and going against what was good for them, they would very often join the military. And as I say, not that I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's a thing that that somehow that helped them. I mean, I can see how it would, to just be told what to do and not have to have that burden of deciding for themselves. And I think that's, it may be another kind of addiction. I don't know. But it's something that we seem to yearn for, and countries have struggled with, I think, a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. There's a lot of truth to what you're saying. There's, I think two thoughts come to mind. In a healthy sense of the word, that being told what to do. I mean, like, for example, when we think of small children, there's a point where their agency isn't developed enough that the most responsible thing, I think, for a parent to do is to tell them what to do. And if it comes down to it, it's because I'm your mother and I said so, because you have a better sense of what's right for your child than they have for themselves at 4 or 5 years old. And there's times when you have to gradually release them to their own agency over the course of 18 to 20 years or whatever. But so there's a healthy way in which, for an immature individual, a child, having that immediate direction is obviously necessary at times. And one might argue, in a healthy sense, that in our own spiritual childhood, having a trusted spiritual director, really, to whom you put your trust and says, this is what I think you need to do in this case until you can kind of grow spiritually. I think there's a healthy way in which structures within spiritual or religious traditions, by submitting to a trustworthy spiritual director or starets, or whatever the word you would want to use, somebody, a spiritual mother or father, I think can be healthy and helpful, because you're getting a trusted, loving, compassionate, but also more objective sense of direction. And that submission helps to free you from having to decide. You just sort of move into a place of spiritual obedience. That, I think, can only be temporary if it's to be healthy. The point, you have to be able to reach a point where you get weaned off of that to some degree and can thrive. Religion, I think, can also become an instance where it becomes the thing, as you alluded to briefly, Joan, that is the problem, because you become so rigid, so fearful, so infantile in your stunted in your spiritual growth, that you really become overly concerned with the exoteric following of a religious tradition, staying within the lines, following this, doing everything exactly. And when you see that mentality, I think you're absolutely dealing with fears that haven't been addressed, fears of my mortality, fears for my eternal well-being, and so forth. And there you reach a point then where the religion becomes crippling rather than a stepping stone to greater spiritual freedom. So that whole gamut, I think, in my lifetime, I've seen both in a healthy sense what it means to submit to an anamkara, which is the original Celtic sense of that, right? A trusted and beloved spiritual master or authority. And then the unhealthy sense where the institutional observance of practices becomes a replacement for real spiritual development, because it's really born of fear. I remember on multiple occasions, Pope Francis has really denounced rigidity among priests and bishops and cardinals in the Roman Church publicly, warning his flock, that is to say Roman Catholics, to beware of rigidity in your religious leaders, because it is always masking duplicity. It is always masking fear. And that's a pretty bold thing for a pope to say of his own bishops and cardinals, but he's done so on several occasions. So he's very aware of some of the dysfunctions in the church being precisely around this issue of an overly rigid adherence to external practices, which more than not do mask some kind of dysfunction, disconnect, fear, rigidity that's hiding some inability to deal with a real spiritual development. Thomas Merton, in his New Seeds of Contemplation, excuse me, in his New Seeds of Contemplation, talks about this idea of traditionalism versus tradition. And he basically says, most people mistake tradition as traditionalism. And he says traditionalism is clinging to sort of the past, aspects of the religion, practices, elements that time will just destroy without any mercy, really just make irrelevant, right? And he says you can easily become buried by that. But he then goes on to say real tradition is more like a mountain, and you stand upon that to get a broader horizon, a broader view. So rather than be buried by traditionalism, the idea is you stand on the mountain of tradition, which broadens your horizon. Those are two very different ways of seeing how the history of your own tradition helps to direct or govern or support you in your current spiritual growth. And it has all to do with how we understand that, really. And I think very often in the church, tradition is mistaken for traditionalism. Thank you. Hi, Jennifer. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to thank you for that prayer. Maybe you could put it up again, the one that you read right before we started our discussion about.
Oh, yeah, this one.
Did you write that?
No, and I should have referenced it. I included that is a prayer that was found in the jacket pocket of a young girl who was killed in Auschwitz, or one of the concentration camps. I take that back. I don't think it was Auschwitz, but it was one of them. And not sure who the author of it is, but it was found in her jacket pocket. And when I was I was teaching at Fordham on 9/11 and in New York, and then the following Good Friday, which would have been, I guess, in March of 2002, Trinity Episcopal, which was right there in downtown Manhattan, did a Stations of the Cross outside, in which we went to these various locations that had to do with the tragedy of 9/11. And at the actual site of the destruction of the towers, in the closing sort of station, this prayer was prayed, and I was deeply moved by that and by its generosity. It's such a tragic time, and how applicable it is not only to the small issues we deal with of people who may hurt us, etc., but with these egregious sort of aspects of life, these kinds of, large scale, horrific moments that I just feel it spoke beautifully. This is I did forward to Joanne last night this thing. So Joanne, you'll be able to send that out, right? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So Jennifer, you're on the list for the. Yeah. So then you'll have that.
And I just wanted to say, not only was it just beautiful in its sentiment, it also sort of reminded me that within me, I have both the good will and the evil will. And just as a sort of a gentle way of not forgetting that, and maybe this sounds a little naive, but perhaps that part of me that tends more towards goodwill to forgive and help bring to wholeness the parts that maybe tend towards evil will. So
yeah,
just wanted to thank you for that.
Yeah, for sure. That's a beautiful insight. And indeed, I mean, I think so much of our own spiritual humility comes from taking this journey into the wilderness, where we really do see, our own struggles with a compassionate light. And that, I think, really does embolden us to be more merciful and forgiving, and more humble about, how we see other people's struggles. All right. So thanks, Jennifer. Appreciate that. Good morning, David.
Good morning. What you write is very honest. I'm 82, and I've come to realize that particularly in areas of woundedness as well as addictions, that this side of the grave, times when I walk along and I limp, and there'd be other times when I walk tall and feel free. And you can feel that freedom for a season, but there can be a trigger. There can be something that sets you back to limping a little bit. And so you may say, I've released that, I've let it go. And for a season you have, but sometimes something just brings it back. And so I guess my sense is this side of the grave, maybe we don't get all healed and we don't get all free. But Christ in us enables us to sometimes limp and sometimes walk.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Very insightful. And I think that that's true. I think that as we make our way through life, at least for me, the younger me kind of was more, I don't know if the word is hopeful or naive about getting it all right in this lifetime. And then you kind of come to the gradual acceptance that there's actually a grace in not getting it all right. It is the thing that really, what would it look like if one of us really reached spiritual perfection, and what new thing, spiritual pride would come out of that, or whatever the case may be. It would always be something, right, that would C.S. Lewis's Screw Tape Letters really speak to the foibles of the human condition around this very thing. So I think not getting it right is beautifully said by Paul about, that whole struggle with the thorn in his side, and my grace is enough for you. And there's something about not getting it right that becomes the very avenue or conduit for real intimacy with God, because it betrays what in fact is our dependency on God, not only for in this moment or with this demon or in that struggle, but for existence itself. And one might even ask if part of what we call eternity isn't also still not getting it right, except learning to more and more rely on the source of our very being. And maybe what happens is we can laugh more at that as we get older, and there in itself is a beautiful liberation and humility, I think, around it. So it's nice to have that youthful naivete, but it's also nice to mellow into a sense of, oh, okay, this is it for the long haul, and I've just got to struggle day to day in these kinds of cycles that you're talking about. Sometimes I'm like walking that razor's edge, and then I slip and fall for a bit, but I get back up again, and that is the spiritual journey, falling and getting up, as has been said. So, thank you for that insight. It's beautifully said. Hi there, Thelma. Go right ahead. Good morning.
Good morning. Well, I just wanted to say, as I was listening and thinking about this, is we all have our addictions. We all do. And none of us, I think, are free of that. However, I think it brings us to that point where we say, I can't, God can. And as a Christian, that is so freeing and so helpful to realize that on my own power, I can't stop this thing that is gnawing at me, but God can help me to be a better person. And thank God for that. Jesus died on the cross for that. To forgive us for those places where we can't, and to give us the strength and the courage to carry on.
Thanks, Thelma. Very hopeful. And indeed, I think that does indeed define the whole of the spiritual life. I can't, you must. And as I talk about later in this chapter, there is a real connection sort of etymologically between the words athleticism and asceticism. They come from the same Greek context, but in athleticism, I think the idea is you learn how to run, right? You learn how to succeed. In asceticism, you learn how to fall, you learn how to fail. And that's it, is learning how to fail, because in that failure comes that very point where you say, you know what, I can't, you must. I need to be carried to the finish line because this isn't going to work on my own. And there's something profoundly liberating when, when Jesus says in the Gospels, you must be like one of these children. In the West, we typically associate first and foremost children with innocence. But in the first century Palestinian culture in which Jesus was talking, that isn't the first go-to. The go-to was powerlessness, trust, helplessness, the way a child would depend on their parent. So him saying you have to be like a child is not a call to childlike innocence. It's a call to childlike trust, the way a small child would trust their mother, their father, to carry them, to care for them. That's what he's calling us to. And there is that sense when we fall down and skin our knees, as it were, to trust that our mother, our father will pick us up and set us straight on our way. So that, I think, is an important lesson. We must remain childlike in that dependence, in that sense of not taking on the burden that we have to save ourselves. Because with that comes a life of terror, for the very reasons that David was talking about. You just realize you just can't get it right all the time. And so that leads to a life of intense scrupulosity and fear and all that rigidity. When you just live in a childlike innocence, in the sense of knowing that you're loved and cared for, it really gives you then the ability to be free, to be a child, knowing that there's this care. That's a very different spiritual orientation, metaphorically. So thank you, Thelma. Hi there, Marika.
Hi. I'm not even quite sure how to articulate this, but I'm going to give it a try. So sometimes I was just thinking about this, about confronting demons, whether it's within oneself, within the family, within the workplace, whatever, that sometimes we do confront them, but then the very process of confronting them sometimes causes us to be overwhelmed by them. And in such a way that we also can't see the positive or the angels within ourselves or within all these other places. And so in a way, by looking at it, it gains more power initially or somewhere in the process. So and then I had another completely different thought, but it's in some ways related, was during the meditation, I'm sitting outside and there's this cloudless sky. And, we're thinking about 20 years ago, and I saw these butterflies wafting, and then a hummingbird, and then an egret, and then some very fast bird that I couldn't make out. And I was just stunned by the beauty of that. And in some ways it's related when we sometimes don't see the beauty when we're confronting evil,
I really appreciate you raising that point. One of the points that I will be making very soon, which for us could mean a few weeks because we're moving so slowly, but in the next several pages of the book, I do actually try to explain that the life of Christian asceticism is a life of reclamation of beauty. That's really what this is about. It's about reclaiming beauty, living beauty, being touched by beauty, seeing beauty, and freeing ourselves from all the things that prevent us from doing that. That really we have in our minds the sense of asceticism being all these practices of self-bodily abuse and mortification and all the eccentric things that we've come to associate with it. But the truth is, by and large, and the history of Christian asceticism has been looked at along what's been called the royal way, which is not so distant from what the Buddhists would call the middle way. So a very moderate approach to prayer and self-assessment, all with the goal, if you want to say, of unshackling whatever prevents us from both embodying beauty, but also seeing and experiencing beauty in the world. So it's nice for you to make that connection, because as you'll see, it will really come to spell that out. Thank you for that. Very nice. Okay, so sorry here. Let's see. I believe that brings us to Mary Sue. Hi.
Hi, thank you. I want to go back to the sentence that Nicola talked. Anything would be better than wandering through the desert wasteland of our hearts, not knowing where our emotional sustenance will come from. That really struck me, kind of in a different way, though. That sense that the ability to go deeper, to look within, to look beyond those addictions to what's underneath them, and having the courage to do that has to be grounded in a sense of being loved, being deeply loved, being held in that love. And when one of the primordial wounds is abandonment, it's a really tough thing. And that's kind of where I find myself. I'm very aware that I have struggled with eating disorders, and one of my go-to things is compulsive eating. And I've been all over the scale on, the eating disorder thing. And while I'm at a place where, from a physical standpoint, I can manage it, from an emotional standpoint, I am very aware when that kicks in. And the ability to look deeper at the woundedness that's underneath it, I know has to be grounded in that love, but sometimes it's really hard to experience that love. I know it in my head, but it's moving it into my heart. And so I just wanted to kind of share that comment and that experience. Thanks.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mary Sue, for putting that out there. I'm sorry for all, I'm sure it's very difficult to struggle with that, especially given the way that our culture deals with food in the first place, make that even all the more difficult. And I think it is often unacknowledged or less acknowledged that open, overt, physical or emotional or psychological abuse is often what we think about in terms of childhood wounds. But I think the negative, neglect, abandonment, those negatives where it's not necessarily an overt abusiveness, but a refrain from real care and love and support is just as deeply wounding in those formative years. And is not as often recognized, the damage that it can do, sort of creating in someone a lifelong struggle. I think regardless of what we have in a sense in our own experiences are, I'm sorry, I was distracted from our own experiences as children, whatever those are, whatever wounds those are, whether they're overt or a matter of negligence, they're the deepest ones we carry. And I think can be difficult, if not impossible, to fully overcome throughout the course of our lifetime. They become the thorn, as it were, right? And that becomes, but remember that thorn is always for us, yes, a unique Achilles heel, but also a unique entry point or receptor of divine grace. And that's what the message of that Pauline text is for me. You know, those wounds become the very place where we become more susceptible to grace, to healing, to love and transformation.
Yeah.
So in some
I
ways,
know when you said that earlier, several weeks ago, it really helped me to look at that as a reminder that this isn't something I'm going to fix by myself. I have to give it over. And it's a reminder to come back to the divine, to come back to God, to come back to that, you know, that God can. I can't, God can. And yet it still is that struggle just doesn't end.
right. I have a nephew who's now in his 20s who very clearly struggles with OCD. And I'm very close with him and have been able to talk to him because I see the patterns. I see sort of the repetitive behaviors and the things that he does. And it can easily become irritating when you're living, you know, when he's visiting and see these repetitive patterns. So I've opened up a very sort of frank, obviously compassionate dialogue with him. And I'm delighted as how cogent he is around the problem. And he really sees it rationally. And he sees how irrational his repetitive behaviors are. But as we've talked it through now on many occasions, one of the things that's really, you know, a lot of what's under OCD is anxiety about something. And one of the things when he was visiting was this obsessive washing of his hands. And, you know, and it has to do with COVID. And, you know, I told him, I said, you know, we've been in the house for the last 3 days. We've not seen anyone. You don't have to keep washing your hands if you haven't encountered some external place where you could have picked this up. And we had this conversation. And what was irritating to me initially was the sense of, it felt very self-absorbed to me, this obsession. But after talking with him, what I realized his deepest fear was not that he would get COVID, but that he would get it and give it to someone else. And he has this tremendous sense of fear around hurting someone and not knowing he did it. Hurting someone emotionally, hurting someone in any way at all, and then not realizing it caused this person harm. So, okay, once we get to that bit, we can start exploring that concern. Where does that concern come from? And once, you know, we could say to him, hey, look, we're going to pre-forgive you for giving us COVID this week, if that should happen. And we'll handle it, and we're vaccinated, and we don't want you to worry about it. And it's amazing how his hand washing diminished a lot after that. Once we freed him from the need to worry about giving us COVID, you know, we were like, if we get it, it's on us, right? And it's interesting then to see how those struggles we have, eating disorders, OCD behavior, repetitive behavior, really needs to address the wound to begin to address the symptom. I mean, it's almost a truism, but it's really interesting to see it happen that way. So thanks, Mary. I appreciate your sharing that. Robert, please.
I think Christine was before me.
Oh, so sorry. All right. Okay, that you jump ahead there for the host. Yeah, Christine, please go right ahead.
Thank you. What's coming up for me through this is the story of Jacob wrestling with the one he met in the desert. And he was left with a limp, a signal that manifests the humility, the gift of that wrestling. And while we struggle and we realize we have to be totally dependent upon God, the true blessing is that we have community that walks beside us, that you demonstrated in your interchange with your nephew. And a person who was very instrumental in my healing said, we're wounded in community and we're healed in community. So I just think it's important to stress this aspect of our struggle and how we move through the desert in company with one another. How important and what a great blessing that is.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. And that, of course, is so true of the Exodus sort of narrative that speaks so clearly to this archetypal journey. I mean, it was the community, right? And God with community in very clear ways and through community that helped get them through that desert time. And I love that saying, we're wounded and we both are wounded and heal in the context of community. That is absolutely true. Yeah, go ahead.
And I was just struck by the prayer from the woman from Raisinbrook. It was all about us. Mm-hmm. It happened through the community that they were able to see from this other place.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah. And I think, just as much as it's scary for each of us to move to that place of self-intimacy where we're exploring these dark sides of ourselves, the shadow side, whatever you want to call that, the demons. That's, I think, what also keeps congregations, spiritual communities from becoming intimate, because then you have to get real with each other and you have to get beyond the polite veneer of we're here on a Sunday, we're going to have our little coffee afterwards and go home. And that's the end of it. Real spiritual community requires our willingness to be hurt at times, right? Step on somebody's toes inadvertently, but then out of that comes the healing, and it's really, it's hard because you don't want to get into these, confrontations with people and so forth. But, I keep saying to my bishops committee here and to people I work with, every light casts a shadow, myself as well. Right. And we have to learn to always see that. And the more you get working with people and close to people and intimate with people, both light and shadow become more apparent. And that is the way in which we are both wounded and healed. It's really well said. Yeah. So thank you for that, Christine. Robert, then please.
Father Vincent, this has been a remarkable time for me. And it's the question that's coming up is, what is freedom? I've been taken to Matthew 6, where Jesus says that you need to choose between loving money and loving God. You can't love both. And it occurs to me that when I love money, that becomes my addiction. And it's about me being free to go after money. But if I am able to choose to love God, then I have to be powerless. I can't go telling God what he needs to do. And, so the fact that I choose to love God means that I am choosing to be like a child, to be powerless. And it also seems to come into the whole business of addiction, that the only way that I can escape addiction is by realizing that I don't have the power to escape it. It's bigger than me. I have to hand this over to God. So, what is freedom? And I'm beginning to wonder if it's about having the power to choose to be a slave to God.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you, Robert. Well said. I think in summary, what I'm hearing is, real freedom is not merely the power to do something, but to refrain from doing something. One could say, hey, I'm free to drink if I want to. The real question is, are you free to stop? Right? And that's the difference between enjoying, a drink with friends and then being governed by alcohol, right? So I'm free to do X, Y, and Z. That's all well and good. But the real question around spirituality is, are you free to not do that, whatever that is? And there, I think, is this question which opens us up to grace. It's and in this country, at least, I don't know how much this is translates to Europe or the various parts of the world where we're represented here, Tasmania and so on. But in this country, it is all about the freedom to do something. There is really no appreciation given to that. Real freedom is giving your freedom up on some level to a higher cause, all right? It's really just, I'm free to do this, right? And we see this happening around mask wearing in this country, right? It's a free country. I don't have to wear a mask, these kinds of freedom. But what is it if we ask the question, not what am I free to do, but what do I do that I'm not free to stop because of a compulsion or a need or a wound or a habit or an addiction? That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where we begin to see our limitations. And then we realize being free to drink, if you're an alcoholic, is your enslavement, right? And better to give yourself fully than to something that will liberate you from that need. But again, just like Israel, we want our garlic and our cucumbers and the roof over our heads and all the stability that the alcohol gave us. Didn't have to look at what's going on inside, gets me through the stress of the day, helps me cope with the realities of life. I mean, all of that then comes away and you're left in the desert wandering and saying, oh my God, what's become of my life? And that's very, very difficult. And to come back to the earlier point, the healing of that comes with community, a 12-step program, a faith community, and so on, is also central to that. Right? So I don't know if that responded to your comments, Robert, but that's what I'm hearing, and I agree with you on that sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you,
Robert. Okay. Other thoughts then, or if not, we can, okay, Jennifer, please go right ahead.
Well, apologies in advance. I've been wrestling with this sort of connection between demons and the false self. And I know I asked you about it a few weeks ago, and you had said demons can make it more likely that we'll live out of the false self. And that really makes a lot of sense to me. But I also wonder, and again, my thoughts are, I'm sort of thinking out loud, but just, I mean, isn't there something to this idea that as long as the false self is sort of firmly entrenched and, nothing is being done about sort of unpacking it or revealing it, making it more conscious, that we're also more susceptible to demons. So could you just say a little bit about all that? And apologies to others if this isn't an issue for you. I'm just trying to sort of understand how it's all connected, and in the hopes of being more compassionate towards myself as well as others. Does that make sense?
So Jennifer, I think I lost your train of thought. It almost felt like the two things you're posing were the same, and I'm not hearing the distinction.
Oh,
so
okay.
part of it is you did break up slightly, so maybe I just missed something. So if you don't mind just trying to restate that, and I'm happy to address it.
Well, okay, and maybe it's not a big deal, but you said the demons make it more likely that we'll live out of the false self. And I just wonder if actually living out of the false self makes us more susceptible to the demons as well, if that makes kind of the reverse. I'm struggling with that connection.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think you're right to say that. I think it's probably very fair to say those things go hand in hand. And I think what the common denominator might be that sense of disconnect. I mean, as you may know from the book, I do distinguish between the ego and the false self, in which I really feel that the ego, which is a natural part of human psychological development, right, that should not be demonized in and of itself, is a tool, and it's neutral, like a hammer is to a carpenter. It's not good or bad. It depends on how the carpenter wields that tool is what makes the difference. So the question is that tool being wielded by the true self, in which case it's constructively building a home, or is it being wielded by the false self, in which it's doing all kinds of destructive things, right? Smashing things and so on. So the ego, I would first of all say, is a neutral, naturally developed evolutionary part of the psychological structure of a human mind and our personalities. And I think it's neutral. The false self, I say, is not to be equated with the ego, because the ego, in fact, does exist, at least as part of our psychological makeup. The false self, I think, does not exist at all. It's as Merton says, it's false, not because there's something there that's untrue, but because it doesn't exist and we think it does. That's what we mean by calling it false. There's no there's no substance, but for what we spin out of our imagination, we give it substance. It's like imagining there's a ghost in front of you and you begin to see that ghost. Doesn't mean it's really there. It's an illusion, but your perception or your fears or your delusional behavior makes you think it's really there. I mean, that's how I think of the false self. So when the hammer comes under the control of those delusional perceptions, now it becomes destructive, because the thing about the so-called false self, that I believe is the delusion that comes from our fear of annihilation in death, of our mortality, of our meaninglessness, of our brokenness, all of those woundedness. It all kind of comes out of it in a very protective nature. And so there's always that grappling. So it is the false self with all of its sort of spinning things out of our imagination based on woundedness and so on, that becomes the perfect entry point for our demons to grab hold and run. And I would say you're absolutely right. They work in tandem, right? The demons both help promote and want to have us persist in this false perception, because it's what would keep it keeps us under the illusion that we have to fight for meaning, for existence, for identity, for purpose, for value. I'm worth something. And on the other hand, we can see that it's that very energy in us that then facilitates our susceptibility to the things that would help to sugarcoat or to medicate or distract us from that struggle. So I think you're right to point out it's two directional. It's not a one-way street. Does that sound right?
Yes, thank you. I feel, again, I'm sorry, this probably isn't an issue for most people, but it keeps coming up for me, just because as I'm trying to understand, Paul talking about the thorn in his side, and just that unending journey of sometimes living out of the false self and sometimes the true self, and just how it all connects to. So thank you.
Yeah, Jennifer, the 4 volumes, I think now 5 have been translated finally into English, of the so-called Philokalia, which, by the way, I don't just recommend you get and read. It's pretty obscure at times, but it comes out of the Eastern contemplative or monastic tradition of Mount Athos. But if you can wade through it or get maybe a condensed version or just even a summary of it, one of the main threads that it is essentially a collection of teachings on the Jesus prayer and what's called in the Eastern Church hesychasm, or in the practice of interior stillness or tranquility. But it's a collection of teachings that go back, I think, from like the 4th century to something like the 17th century. I mean, it's a huge number of centuries of collected teachings from various monks of Mount Athos. And I think that one of the threads there is watchfulness, which you could call, I guess, meditation, but it's more than just meditating. It's observing, it's watching, it's noticing. what is this link between my susceptibility to addictive behaviors or hurtful or counterproductive behaviors and the ego, the false self? What is the link, and how does one end up facilitating the other, kind of like a ping pong match? But what they constantly are talking about is the need to be watchful, to guard your thoughts, to guard your emotions, to guard what you say, just to be aware. And the primary way that they talk about doing that is through the Jesus prayer, which becomes a filter. You know, before I say that mean-spirited thing to this person sitting in front of me, let me filter it through the Jesus prayer and see if it still makes sense to do that, kind of thing. And it becomes the way in which we ground ourselves in the true self or in the compassionate self. And we begin to cultivate a deeper sense of what's going on in terms of what they would call logismoi, or the thoughts or emotions or negative things that keep coming up in our head. We watch those, we notice those, we observe those as if a third party, which begins for us to see it. Doesn't mean we won't at times become susceptible, but you catch it more easily. You see it more readily. You hone that ability through this idea of watchfulness, interior watchfulness. So I hope that helps, Jennifer. Denny, hi, good morning.
Good morning. One thing that's been so heavy on my heart these days centers around 9/11, but not the event particularly. I wonder in my own heart, when are we as a community going to get to forgiveness? When are we going to keep bringing up the terror and the grief? And certainly I understand the grief. I'm a hospice chaplain, so I get where the grief is coming from, and I honor that. But what about the hundreds of thousands of people and their families that died in Afghanistan? What about the 500,000 babies that died in Iraq because of our financial embargo during those years in the 90s and on into 2000s? That's what's heavy on me. Do we pray for them too? Do we remember them too? Or are they just throwaway people and it's all about us? That's what's really weighing heavy, our addiction to violence, and how as a community we actually believe that violence is going to make things better, when actually every day it's shown to us that it's made it twice as bad as it was at 9/11. And I think of Thomas Keating's, when he talks about safety and security, how we are totally addicted to that. I think we've spent like over $20 trillion just to keep safe in this country. So I just want to bring that up because I don't hear that, and it's so heavy on my own heart to remember everyone that has been affected in this world through this horrible tragedy. And the tragedy, of course, was going on way before 9/11 for other people in other countries. And so I just wanted to bring that up. I don't really require a response, Vincent, but for me, it's really important to remember, if I'm going to say I'm a follower of Jesus in the gospel, that everything counts and every human being counts. And so that's what I'm grappling with in my own heart these days. Thanks.
Thanks, Denny. I appreciate that. The closing prayer that I used today, I think is applicable to all of what you just said. I mean, how we direct the violence, the goodwill, the forgiveness. I think, being measured by the good that comes out of responses to violence, to military exploits by the United States long before 9/11 in the Middle East, broken promises made by the United States to many countries in the Middle East, and so on. It becomes a prayer that, in my mind, is for all who experience this kind of tragedy. I do think that forgiveness is going to be slow and gradual. I think, though, forgiveness is different than the examination of our own exploits in the Middle East long before. In other words, us coming to reckon with the death toll you just, shared with us in the Middle East is a different question that needs to be addressed regardless of, say, a 9/11 family's member at this point being willing to address the 19 hijackers. We can, I think, segregate those and see them as related but separate journeys. We have to come to reckon with our own international policies, our own militaristic obsessions in this country. And that is a very real, I think, spiritual practice we need to do as United States. I remember shortly after 9/11, one of my biggest anxieties was the fear of US reprisals and what that would look like. And 20 years later, we see what that looked like. And it was right to be terrified of that on some level. So I understood that the military power of this country was going to be a terrifying thing to contend with when you had a country so wounded and shocked and all by those events. So it's a very complex issue. And in many ways, I think that the memories of these things get locked into the psyche of a particular country or people or nation, and really can become unaddressed wounds that never quite get to the place of forgiveness, but as this thing that you did to us. And that's what I think continues to create so many geopolitical tensions we experience even today, because that sentiment goes to both sides. All right. So thank you. It's very complicated, Denny. I appreciate you bringing that up. Well said. Penny, please.
Yes, thank you, Denny, particularly for discussing security, because that's one of the things I've been thinking about as a form of addiction that is sort of pervasive in this culture, that we need to focus on our own security. And I'm thinking of it in terms of finances, because Robert mentioned the issue of money. As good middle-class people, we're taught so much to focus on insurance, our health, our safety, our property. If we just look at the money that goes into insurance, the idea that somehow we can protect ourselves and focus only on our own well-being, some of it is responsible, but it's also a culture. And it goes back to Denny's comments that it's a highly individualistic thing. And I think that in some ways, this is sort of addictive. The way in which our financial security gives us an illusion of control, self-control, and also passing our assets on to our children and so on if we have any. But the thing that strikes me is, having lost my home in the Oakland fire, when you are stripped of everything, when you are stripped of all your possessions, your house, you're standing basically there with nothing except the clothes you're on your back. That is probably the place of most spiritual humility, that you are like everybody else. When it comes down to the end of it, we are with nothing. We come into the world with nothing, and we leave the world. We leave it all behind. And yet the illusion of our whole way of life, particularly here, is that we don't see that identification with other people. Some people had no insurance. Some people were never able to rebuild. Some people, had to move on because there was nothing they could do. Somehow this idea that we can control our lives by relying on ourselves, and it breaks this continuity with community. And I just want to mention that because, I think the most spiritually meaningful times at the death of a loved one or a major loss is it brings us back to the fact that, as Thelma said, we can't do it. And we pretend with all of these structures we put around our lives that we can, quote, do it. We can protect ourselves, but we can't protect ourselves from that ultimate facing that we are here with nothing, and we have to trust in God's grace. So this conversation has led me to think about different kinds of addiction, of being addicted to our own safety and always protecting ourselves. I see it now with people's fear about COVID, not wanting to be around people, to a point where they just cannot accept the science and accept the risks. They think there's somehow a life to be led without any risk, but every time we get in a car, there's a risk. But we overblow this now to a point where the people who are vaccinated and safe and everything, they are still so fearful. So there's kind of a dilemma here. We have to come to a point of accepting that life is not full of risks, without risks. And we have the ultimate risk, basically. We are mortal and we have to trust in God. So this conversation, I think, has brought me to a new understanding of what kind of addictive behaviors actually are part and parcel of our lifestyle here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Penny. I see your point, and it's true that the egregious so-called addictions that are so abundantly manifest in somebody who's on Skid Row because of alcohol or drug addiction or heroin or whatever are so much easier to see than the types of addictions that are nebulous and are more about safety and security, and that in many ways are supported socially as a thing, right? Even like workaholism, as we call it. I mean, and an addiction to work as a way of avoiding any real intimacy with self and all. In our culture, which is so hell-bent on productivity, that's a very difficult addiction to recognize, to diagnose, to acknowledge, and to get out from under, because it's supported by society as, oh, look at that person. They're such a model of hard work and, so forth. So it's those nebulous aspects of our addictions, especially those that are supported by industry or supported by society, that become both harder to recognize and I think to cope with on some levels, because we're getting a whole support network to actually affirm its virtue rather than see it as vice. Right. So well said. Yeah, it's a big struggle. Okay, I see we're at about 8:36 now, so I'm going to go ahead and call up the our sheet again. I want to review quickly with you the practice that I'm suggesting for this coming week, and then we can move to a discussion if any of you would like to about this past. So this week's, I invite you to practice a kind of a meditation of loving kindness and indeed forgiveness for a person whose own unresolved struggle with their demons has hurt you. So practicing forgiveness for a person whose unresolved struggle with their demons has hurt you. And as you offer up this intention, the question is, what begins to shift in you? I've worded this very specifically so that as we do this meditation, it's not merely about what X, Y, or Z has done to offend, hurt us or whatever, but to see that what they've done is a result of their own unresolved struggle with demons, just like we have. And that's why I'm putting it that way, to see this as a, when we read the story of Exodus, it is not really Pharaoh and Moses who are at war with one another. It is the gods of Egypt and the God of Israel that's at war. And the way that Exodus portrays that is, this is not just a military battle between nations or individuals. This is a battle of the gods. And I'm wording it this way so that as you attempt to cultivate loving kindness, that you see it as a person who is grappling with unresolved spiritual energy, if you want to say, or demonic energy, right, in themselves, and to see how that begins to shift your capacity to forgive and what that does for you. Okay, so that's my invitation for you this week. For last week, or what we can discuss now. So here for today's conversation, I've asked you to name a renegade demon, even if it is one, I'm sorry, that's not now, that's not. Even if that's one you do not wish to share with the group, What unhealed psychological wound, emotional trauma, or addictive tendency gives it life in you? As you enter this place of woundedness, what begins to shift in your relationship with that demon, as it's called? So to name a renegade demon you recognize in yourself, even if it's one you don't wish to share, particularly with the group, but to ask yourself what unhealed psychological wounds, emotional trauma, addictive tendencies it gives life to. And then what begins to shift in your relationship. So let me go ahead and stop that and see if there's any takers for this week. Sylvia, I'm just seeing the your contribution to the chat box and just say thank you for that. It's beautifully said. I sometimes don't get to catch up on reading these. Hi, Christine, go right ahead.
I would just say that once again, for me and my struggle with this, not just the comfort and grace I receive from God, but from a supportive community has just really been what has helped in the transformation of my own feelings towards others.
Mm-hmm. When you say
and how they've affected my woundedness.
You said transfer of your feelings toward others?
Transformation.
Oh, transformation of your feelings. Oh, yeah, right, right. I was recently talking to a friend here in this area who's wealthy. He's been very successful financially, in a way, completely different stratosphere than I will ever know, and also a very deeply contemplative man who struggles to support initiatives that, with his resources, that I think is very generous of a host of a gamut of areas that are quite actually noble. But I remember, in this recent conversation, I said to him, look, the reality is I will never be in the stratosphere of wealth that you are. That's just the reality. And yet to most of the world, I'm pretty wealthy. We all are, I think, by the virtue of the fact that we have computers that allow us to even be at this venue speaks something about, a certain degree of accessibility. And it's interesting that as much as I can point upward to the wealthy or the 1% or the uber wealthy and sort of blame, to most of the world, I'm up. And that's one of the things I think it's important to realize, that the difference between me and my friend is not nearly as vastly different as me and someone who's living in a shanty town. I mean, he and I both go on vacation. He might be in a 5-star hotel and I'm in a camper, but we're on vacation. I have a roof over my head. It's a small footprint, and he might be in a mansion, but I still have a roof over my head. I'm not questioning what I'll eat tonight. It might not be filet mignon, but it's not going to be cat food either. So there's a sense in which, the basics are there in terms of it. He just has better quality and more of it, but the basics are there. That is a very contrasting view to someone who doesn't know when their next meal is coming from, or is living in a cardboard box under a bridge, and vacation is not even something that would enter their vocabulary, right? So there's a sense in which, to most of the world, we are up if we have these essential sort of things that we engage in. So whenever I'm pointing a finger, there's always that question of, as I'm making that accusation, let me rephrase it this way. The question becomes, to whom am I Pharaoh? Right? We can point to the pharaohs around us, but one of the questions really boils down as, to whom am I Pharaoh? Right? To whom have I been a tyrant, or so forth? And before I point to those who may seem that to me, it's important for us to examine that question. So I can accuse people of being Pharaoh or pharaonic, I guess, but the question becomes, how does that come to life in me? Yeah, for others. Robert, please.
Father Vincent, as you know, my background is academia. Used to run an MBA program. And I have to confess that I had an addiction to money.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened is that I came to realize on my spiritual path that money is not a goal, but actually a constraint. So if I'm living in a cardboard box and I don't know where my next meal is coming from, that constrains everything that I do. You know, I'm really powerless, totally powerless. But I equally become powerless if I have enough money and yet still spend all of my time, my energy, trying to get more and more and more. And I think it's a very difficult addiction because society says the more money you have, the better you are as a person, you know. And it's one to really stop and be able to see that I have enough. And the tools that I taught my students, my field was strategic marketing. I cannot get you to buy a product unless I rob you of joy. I have to create dissonance. I have to say to you, you know, that car that you're driving is fine, but you need to be driving a BMW or a Rolls Royce. All right. So I need to create dissonance. I need to rob you of your joy. Or to come along with the, you know, the product that I'm selling, which is going to give you back that peace, you know, by you know, giving you something that will seal that gap of dissonance. And it's deeply manipulative, deeply manipulative. And, you know, when Jesus says you really need to love God or money, I'm beginning to understand why. Mm-hmm. And it's not to say that money is unimportant. You can't tell a staff in person that money is unimportant. Of course it's important. But it's when we start to love it, when we have much more than we need, and yet so we keep striving for more and more. That's where the addiction trips in.
Right.
And I have to tell you, I am so blessed that I'm not teaching people that dark art anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, Robert, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those culturally supported addictions that is very hard to break because money means success and success means prestige and prestige means, you know, people like you and put you on I mean, it just, there's no end to it. And it really, what wealth is about is access. It gives you access to other wealth and other wealthy people, and it gives you access to politicians, which gives you power and so forth and so on. And so indeed, if we're stewards of our resources, our financial resources, all good. But like anything, when we become addicts and it's never enough, it's seriously a problem. And one that, you know, you talk about the dissonance. In many ways, our market economy is based on continuing to perpetuate the illusion that you have needs that you don't. That's what it boils down to, right? Perpetuating that illusion. And that just speaks to the heart of all of our deepest woundedness. And no matter what expression, there's the illusion that money can fix it because you can have this car or, you know, this house or this whatever. And it's profoundly addictive for those of us who struggle with being incarnate, you know, and wanting those needs and securities and passions satiated. As part of our evolutionary drive, it becomes profoundly addictive because of what it can give to us. You know, so just this, you can just hear how clearly commercials and ads are intentionally generating a sense of need, telling you need something, telling you you're inadequate if you don't have it, and getting you to believe that. Right? So thank you for that, Robert. So, excuse my cough. Any further comments before we close for this week? right. Well, I want to thank you for sharing, as always, from such deep and rich places. It really is a blessing to all of us, especially when so many of you have shared from this real vulnerable place. I really appreciate the comments you've made and the insights you've offered today. I wish you all a very blessed day, a peaceful day, a day of prayer for peace the world over, and to remember both this day and its aftermath in the world, in our hearts and in our prayers today. So with that, I bid you peace and benum Christinet. I greet Christ within you and send you with my blessing, 3 in 1 and 1 in 3.